Hey, what's good, YouTube? This is Who Is Like God, and we're back with the Messiah 2024 series. It's built over into 2025, but now we've looked at all the prophetic credentials of Christ. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I invite you to check out the playlist. Dope stuff. Beyond that, we're actually going to look and compare other people who claim to be the Messiah among the children of Israel. And we're actually going to get a real tangible way to see how Jesus, Christ, Yeshua, HaMashiach, is the only Messiah. Because you're comparing him to other people who claim to be the Messiah and see how they did not have the same credentials that Christ did. So it goes to show, it brings it to the next level. And we're starting that conversation by looking at the Egyptian. This is the same Egyptian that Paul was actually confused for in the New Testament that we get information about from Josephus. Acts 21:38. Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness? Paul replied, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Sicilia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people. So in that verse, the Apostle Paul is apprehended and he's being questioned by the Roman guard, who actually mistakes him for being the Egyptian who led out the assassins into the wilderness. Here's something very interesting when we look deep in, is that when we actually look at the Greek word used that's translated as assassin, it's Sicarri, meaning this Egyptian individual that Paul was mistaken for was a leader of the Sicarri who saw himself as a messianic warrior to take over Jerusalem. Now, it is worth saying, I believe, that an Israelite here is confused for an Egyptian, just like Moses in the Old Testament. Especially since Paul is from Tarsus in Sicilia, he was still, as an Israelite, mixed up for an Egyptian individual by the Roman guard. I think there's value in saying that. But the primary source information for the Egyptian is actually from Josephus, who was a historian that was a contemporary of the apostles. Josephus writes in his Antiquities, book 20, starting at verse 169, he says, Moreover, there came out of Egypt about this time to Jerusalem one that said he was a prophet, and advised the multitude of the common people to go along with him to the Mount of Olives, as it was called, which lay over against the city, and at a distance of 5 furlongs. He said further that he would show them from hence how, at his command, the walls of Jerusalem would fall down, and he promised them that he would procure them an entrance into the city through those walls when they were fallen down. Now when Felix was informed of these things, he ordered his soldiers to take their weapons and came against them with a great number of horsemen and footmen from Jerusalem and attacked the Egyptian and the people that were with him. He also slew 400 of them and took 200 alive. But the Egyptian himself escaped out of the fight but did not appear anymore. Now this is from Josephus, the same author, in another text called Jewish Wars, where he says this: There was an Egyptian false prophet that did the Jews more mischief than the former, for he was a cheat and pretended to be a prophet also, and got together 30,000 men that were deluded by him. These he led round about from the wilderness to the mount which was called the Mount of Olives. He was ready to break into Jerusalem by force from that place, and if he could but once conquer the Roman garrison and the people, he intended to rule them by the assistance of those guards and of his that were to break into the city with him. But Felix prevented his attempt and met him with his Roman soldiers, insomuch that when it came to battle, the Egyptian ran away. So this is actually pretty insane, because here's a guy that no one has ever heard of, most of, in Christendom, in the evangelical world. This is not someone that's really studied or talked about, but he was so influential that he had a following of 30,000 men. Think about how crazy this is. This Egyptian, presumably Israelite, had a following of thousands of men who intended to ride into Jerusalem and conquer it. And the reason this is so fascinating is because we can look at some Dead Sea Scrolls, such as War of the Messiah. I believe that's the one where we have this picture of the Messiah coming and killing the Kittim, or the Romans. So we know, among other things, among recognition that there was a suffering Messiah or a divine sufferer and sort of a priestly Messiah figure from Second Temple texts and Dead Sea Scrolls, there was definitely a picture of a ruling, reigning, victorious warrior Messiah among the Israelite diaspora at that time, right? Because they were suffering at the hands of the Romans. And we can see that this Egyptian guy seems to be claiming that sort of motif for himself, because he seems, in the first Josephus, we learn that he has this idea that he's going to come and the walls of Jerusalem are going to fall down just like Jericho. So this guy is saying that at his command, the walls of Jerusalem will fall down just like Jericho in the Old Testament. and combining what he says in Jewish Wars, Josephus, it seems like his intention was to then go in Jerusalem and rule it with his followers. So this man, evidently, this Egyptian, had this messianic identity because his whole goal was to conquer Jerusalem, and he believed he was going to rule Jerusalem, which is the task ultimately of the Messiah. He was stopped by the Romans, the very people he intended to conquer and told his followers they would win. He was defeated by, and after that, no one ever heard of him again. He disappears from history. So this is an example of how any other Messiah who claimed to be somebody, after they were stopped, their movement would just die out. Jesus, Yeshua, is the only one that would actually explode after his resurrection, when the apostles made a total 180 and started proclaiming something that they didn't even believe first at the beginning, according to the New Testament. Jesus' movement is the only one that continued after his death because his followers genuinely believed that he rose, whereas every other Messiah's movement just died and fizzled out after they got defeated by the Romans, the same government, and the Egyptian is a great example of that as well. Here's the thing. Now we gotta put the Egyptian under scrutiny. In the same way we've been looking at Christ under scrutiny for this whole playlist, we're gonna do it with the Egyptian. Every other person who claimed to be the Messiah among the children of Israel, and see how Jesus filled the qualifications that anyone else did. Let's peep this. Did the Egyptian save the children of Israel physically or spiritually? He did not. He intended to conquer the Romans. He was defeated and fell out of history. So he didn't save them physically. Did he save them spiritually? No. When you look at the scriptures, we know the ministry of reconciliation logically had to happen before the annihilation of the nations. So again, let's look at the Egyptian's credentials after breaking that down. He did not cause the oppressors of the Romans to come and believe in the same God and start actually living by precepts of the Torah. He had 30,000 men followers, but that was the sort of the limit. His movement ended after that, so he didn't reach or influence more than 30,000 people in his lifetime. So these are probably Jews anyway, since he seems to have these messianic expectations tied to Jerusalem and tied to the physical reign of the Messiah. No worldwide impact the Messiah is said to have in Genesis 49:10 or Isaiah 11:9-10. We covered that a little bit before. The worldwide effect of the Messiah before the second Exodus is how we could say Jesus did fulfill that, and we have faith in the second Exodus and the restoration on the throne of David, which is to come if this had to happen first, which Jesus did do. The Egyptian did not do. So the worldwide effect of the Messiah is something that's talked about, is a motif in the scriptures that Jesus fulfilled, again, from a historical perspective, from the first century outward, looking at his effect on the nations, what we may refer to as church history among the different communities that would be founded by belief in the God of Israel through Christ. When you break it down Hebraically outward. And now what I want to do is look at every single prophecy we looked at Jesus for and the Messiah 2024 playlist and compare it to the Egyptian. And we'll see how the Egyptian fails and Jesus was succeeded just by being objective as possible. So anyone who claims to be the Messiah is getting the same scrutiny, is getting the same work. You feel me? We're going to look through all the prophecies and see just how rare and just how it really is only one individual who is truly the Messiah. It's not like anyone claiming to be the Messiah is him scripturally. Let's start with Daniel chapter 2. This worldwide effect of the Messiah is one of the biggest things that Jesus, completely consistent with the Torah in his lifetime, caused among the nations that the Egyptian did not. Daniel chapter 2. God's kingdom comes in the days of Rome, and it would be initiated and never ends. Now Jesus and the Egyptian were both in the time of Rome. But Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world, and had a worldwide effect from the children of Israel to the nations among these groups of people that continue even into the modern time, thousands of years. The Egyptian would fall out of history after the Romans stopped him, where Jesus, evidently, the Romans did not stop him. The persecution by the Romans, by the apostles at the hands of the Romans did not stop them, did not stop the proclamation. Teaching from the law and the prophets, there are billions in the world to hold fast to the God of Israel and account of Christ today. The same cannot be said for the Egyptian who just wanted to rule Jerusalem and failed. Daniel 9, very specific prophecy that the serpent is predicted to come and be cut off at the 69th week, according in some way to God's messianic overall purpose. Now, there's no evidence at all that the Egyptian was killed or even exiled. He just fell out of history after the battle because he actually escaped, and some of the other men that were in his army got cooked and got apprehended by the Romans, by Felix. You know that Felix ruled from 52 to 60 AD roughly. So the other thing is, not only does the Egyptian not feel this, but the time the Egyptian's movement was ended, where you could argue he was cut off, was past the time of the 69th week by any method of interpretation. There are a couple different interpretations and methodologies when it comes to Daniel 9 and mapping out the 70 weeks. But no matter where you get to, the 69th week for the Messiah to become off is always before the years 52 and 60. From what I see, you always get a range of roughly 26, 27 AD to 33 AD, which are the two buckets of Jesus' ministry. He came, he didn't suffer what the anointed one was supposed to suffer, and he ended his movement, forcibly was ended way after the time of the 69th week at face value. Yet Yeshua came at the right time, at the right junction, and he was honestly cut off. So this is someone who fits the motif in some way, connected to God's purpose that this individual would be cut off and suffer this at the 69th week in some correlation to God's plan to bring in everlasting justice and righteousness and to atone for iniquity and all these different types of things. Malachi 1:11. Here's into the nitty gritty. Very specific things that Jesus caused to happen that the Egyptian did not. God predicts a broadening of the priesthood in Malachi 1:11, where there will be incense and offerings given to him among the nations beyond just Jerusalem. Jesus and his vision for God's kingdom caused this to happen among the Gentile nations, and because of the ancient Jewish practice, many Gentiles in the early global church would start offering incense as well as a practice to honor God through Christ, who was proclaimed by the apostles. So just from that perspective, if we're being non-presuppositional, what God says will happen in the world happened because of Christ and this ancient messianic belief system that is reflected by that. The Egyptian did not cause Gentiles to offer incense to God like God has a vision for in Malachi, which speaks to his name being acknowledged among the nations. Malachi 3, God predicts a restoration of the Levites ultimately before the temple was destroyed, because that would be in the year 70. Jesus did this, and we can track this because of his teaching based on principles in the scriptures that were often neglected in his day, such as I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Jesus taught in the temple, answered many questions in the temple, clarified what the greatest commandments were, which were the foundation for the law and the prophets, the Old Testament: love God with your entire being and to love your neighbor as yourself. So imagine Jesus teaches these things to his community in the temple would have had an effect, a positive effect on the Levites just by nature of his teaching coming from the Old Testament to his community and what we can track. And since Acts 6:7 tells us that many priests came to believe in Christ, we get to see that there were many Levites who would have been restored and had the right understanding in the window between Jesus' ministry and the destruction of the temple. The Egyptian did not have this effect because he tried to enter Jerusalem forcibly and his whole movement stopped. So he did not have any noticeable, documented, or written effect on the Levites because his whole movement was one towards being the king of Jerusalem, which failed. I touched on this before, but Isaiah 11, how the Messiah is supposed to restore the nations before the second Exodus. The implication of this is that the nations would come to acknowledge God, and then Israel would eventually become the head of the nations through the Messiah. So Jesus did this, and we could track this both physically and spiritually if you accept Yeshua as the Messiah, because there are certain tribal identities in the modern time, like the Lemba people, most of whom recognize an Israelite heritage, but proclaim Yeshua as the Messiah. So Jesus did do this. Jesus was the one whom the nations inquired about and came to believe in God through. The Egyptian did nothing like this, both for his people, to cause them to be either physically or spiritually regathered, which comes after the salvation of the nations in the first place. He didn't do either of these things. Isaiah 42, the Messiah, or the servant, if you want to say that, is predicted to be a light to the nations. Now Jesus was, and we can see this without necessarily believing in him, just because his teachings were based on the Old Testament and things that many people in his community forgot, various principles, various traditions that blinded the way of following the commandments of God. So from that perspective, we can see the effect Jesus would have and being a light to the nations from a Hebraic standard of the Old Testament, and looking at that effect that would go among the nations from that perspective. The Egyptian was not. Beyond his 30,000 militant followers, and his army, it would just end and that would be it. He would not have any effect on the Goyim, on the nations, and he would not be a light to them. Jesus was. He caused millions to believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to conduct themselves with the principles of the Torah that he and the apostles would have been teaching from when they wrote what we now know as the New Testament. Isaiah 50 to 53, this motif of the suffering servant, which Jesus fulfilled, and what he said his ministry was about, and that the apostles believed before they went back to the Old Testament, was this ministry of death and suffering for the sins of the world. And another thing too is a resurrection is implicit within Isaiah 53, which when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. So even though I look at the resurrection stuff and the old prophecy stuff as separate categories, there is an implicit resurrection in Isaiah 53. So how insane does it become that these apostles, we know historically with the scholarship of the Jesus movement, were generally believing Christ authentically in his resurrection before they went to the Old Testament prophecy as proof, when the resurrection is implicit within the prophecy in the first place? That's insane. The Egyptian did not. He was not killed, nor was he believed to have resurrected for the sins of Israel or the nations. He had this militant Messiah hat, and after it was stripped off, he disappeared. Another one is Isaiah 49, because this Isaiah 49 is a picture, a motif of someone who is rejected by the Israelites, yet is a light to the nations and is vindicated by kings and priests, or kings and princes. Jesus fits this to a T of someone who taught from the scriptures, was wrongfully condemned from a Torah standpoint in the court trial, rejected by his people, yet he would be a light to the nations from the same effect we've looked at in Isaiah 42, and cause kings and princes, kings and their sons around the world across multiple empires to come to believe in God on account of him. So God says his vindication of the servant would be from the fact that kings and princes would kneel before you, even though your own people rejected you in your ministry. That fits Jesus and his whole historical effect on the world and on the Gentile nations, the sons of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, or Japheth and Ham especially, because Shem is the line that Israel would come from. His tremendous effect on these groups of people, which the Egyptian did not have. Nor was he someone that was despised by Israel, accepted by the nations, and vindicated by kings and priests of those nations. That motif is not felt by the Egyptian, who he may have had a mixed crowd of followers, Jews and Gentiles, but after he was defeated, his movement ended. Genesis 49:10. The Messiah arrives before Judah loses its scepter. We made a video about this to go how, even from our early rabbinic understanding and looking at the scriptures in the original context, this would speak to the Messiah coming before Judah loses its authority or tribal authority. This aligns perfectly with both the birth and ministry of Jesus, depending on which date you want to lose for the Sanhedrin losing its right to exercise capital punishment. But this central thing in the court system of Israel that they lost at the hands of the Romans, this unprecedented phenomenon, so to speak, aligns perfectly with Jesus coming before that point. The Egyptian does not fit this bill because his ministry was, we don't know when it began, but we know it was around the time of 52 to 60. So after the time of Christ, it's after the time of Christ when the Egyptian is popping off and when his movement gets stopped, because Felix, who stopped him, was in around 52 to 60 AD. So the one would have to come before the children of Israel lost their right to capital punishment, which the latest date for that, according to early Talmudic sources, would be the 30s AD. So even if we take a late date for when the children of Israel lost their scepter, the Egyptian comes way after this point, disqualifying him from being the Messiah within the timeline, or at least making his case for the Messiah extremely that much more weak. Amos 8:9 to 10 reveals that darkness will happen from noon, from noon to 3, because of God's judgment. What Amos reveals is that judgment in the Hebrew Bible is the meaning of darkness. So how fascinating does it become that when Jesus was crucified, there was darkness all around among the Roman Empire? And when we look at things Hebraically, we know what that means Hebraically, is that this prophet, this one who claimed to be the Messiah, when he was crucified wrongfully, this darkness would suggest God's judgment, because we know what darkness means in Amos and the prophets. And this darkness is attested to in a number of sources, several sources outside the New Testament. This is fascinating for any studier of history and looking at Christ, that this symbol of God's judgment from the Old Testament, what is a symbol of God's judgment, would befall this prophet who was completely consistent with the law and his own ministry that everybody recognized and interpreted. Beyond that, this never happened for the Egyptian because he was never crucified. Let alone nationwide darkness happened when he was crucified, which happened to Jesus, which fits the motif of Amos 8, verses 9 to 10. Again, Genesis 12, Psalm 46:10 speaks to the inhabitable world, knowing the true God, what we would now know, various continents, knowing the God of Israel, happened because of Christ from the first century. For the last 2,000 years, various nations coming to believe in God through the Messiah, which would be something the Messiah would do. This is linked to the ministry of the Messiah in Isaiah 11. So because the proclamation of the Messiah caused nations to believe in God, shows Christ is the Messiah, among other things. Vindication from a non-presuppositional level. Isaiah 56. Jesus was a catalyst for Gentiles to follow various precepts of the Torah. We talked about this earlier, various principles. When you objectively follow Christ and the apostles, you're following precepts of the Torah, because when you follow God and you love Jesus, and you truly love God with all your heart and you're producing good works, you're following precepts of the Torah like justice, mercy, and faithfulness. So not only did Jesus cause this to happen among the Gentile world and cause various improvements of society in the Gentile cultures because of this foundation, but various Gentile communities throughout history have decided to do specific mitzvot, such as observing the Sabbath, something originally given just for the Hebrew people, have Gentiles decided to do, which is a literal fulfillment of Isaiah 56, arguably, in just a way to see Jesus' Hebraic effect on the nations in light of what is the freedom we have in Christ in the new covenant. Psalm 22 as a motif that Jesus quotes as he's on the cross. He was suffering and pierced for the sins of his people. The Egyptian was not. He was never killed or crucified. There's no record of that. He just disappeared throughout history. And because of all the trouble he caused, we'd have reason to believe that there would be a Jewish source or at least a Roman source that would mention him being killed if the Romans truly did get rid of this troublesome prophet. But there's no record of him getting captured. He ran away while his followers got apprehended after the Jerusalem ambush failed. Micah 5:2, the Messiah would have to be born in Bethlehem. We know from the census in Luke that Jesus was born in Bethlehem because of the census of Caesar Augustus. Whereas the Egyptian, we don't know where he's born. We don't even know his tribal lineage. But since he's referred to as the Egyptian, we can assume that he was a native of Egypt, probably Alexandria. And so most probably, even though it's not concrete, his birthplace was not in the place where the Messiah, true Messiah, is said to be born from because of the lineage from David. Like I said, we don't even know this guy's lineage. So a lot of these things, it's hard to even quantify him as a candidate because we don't know his lineage that is necessitated to look at some of these prophecies. But even if we grant that, we still have him not doing things the Messiah is supposed to do that Jesus did in the order, logically, and on just imagine that to the effect of Christ that Jesus did. Now, as far as self-identity goes, we know in the Torah the full nature of the Messiah is the divine being. When you look at the scriptures in their original context, we can look at the ancient Israelite community, the Israelite diaspora. They recognized a divine Messiah, and so did the scriptures themselves. This is who Jesus claimed to be. He claimed to be the I am, the Word made flesh. When you look at his claims, not just in the book of John, but in the synoptic gospels as well. What that means is we have to put Christ under scrutiny because Christ rejected idolatry. He recognized the only God that deserves worship is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and yet had this identity that he was around and existing before he was ever born. So knowing that this man comes from the tribal lineage of David, claiming to bring the kingdom, doing miracles in our midst, rejecting idolatry, upholding the law, claims to be this identity, this hypostasis, this manifestation of Yahweh that was recognized by the community, we have to truly look at him and see if he was this figure. But his identity matches the full nature of what the Torah predicts in the first place, whereas the Egyptian did not. Why? Belgian Catholic theologian Edward Skillebeck characterized the Egyptian as an Egyptian Jewish eschatological miracle-working prophet who predicted the destruction of Jerusalem's walls akin to the falling walls of Jericho in Joshua 6. So that was the Egyptian's big claim to fame. This Egyptian prophet claimed to be, he's going to cause the walls of Jerusalem to fall, just like in Jericho, and that'll be a symbol. That never happened. His army, his zealotry was destroyed. So the fact is, when you look at the full nature of what the Torah predicts for Israel's king, The identity of the Egyptian, based on all the historical sources we can glean from, does not match the full nature of what the Torah predicts. So if the Torah predicts someone that's more than just a man, and here's someone who's just a man claiming to be the Messiah, you're not the biblical Messiah, because the biblical Messiah is a divine being. Ultimately, I believe we can argue God in the flesh from the Hebrew Bible, but at least a spiritual being who's going to come and restore Israel. Numbers 24:17 and some other passages. So just an Egyptian eschatological prophet doesn't fit the bill of what the Torah predicts. So that's another disqualifying thing, that Jesus, his identity, matches and ultimately is vindicated not only by the things he did that no man can do in his ministry, if you're willing to accept it, but as just Torah and the prophets, his consistency with the law and his effect tested against the Old Testament and what was predicted to happen of the Messiah. So when we lay it out like this, we can see there are some vague parallels in the sense that the Egyptian and Jesus would be in roughly the same time period that the Messiah was supposed to come in the days of Rome. But when we study beyond that, we see the Egyptian did not do anything he was supposed to do for the children of Israel, or anything he was supposed to do for the nations. Jesus did what he was supposed to do in restoring the children of Israel based on his teachings from the Torah, based on the fact that any Israelite who would have heeded Jesus' teachings would have had a closer relationship with God because they're following the law with the right attitude, right? Not getting caught up in various traditions that make void the commandments. So when tradition superseded commandments, which was a real problem, getting rid of that and looking at how God really cares about the heart as opposed to just ritual, reviving these principles in the Israelite community. Not only could we track Jesus' positive effect on the people from that perspective and on the priests from that perspective, but his effect on the world as a whole as the Messiah to the coastlands would be an effect that Jesus would have based on things he said in his ministry and after his resurrection, what the apostles believed and changed their lives for, versus the Egyptian who would have 30,000 followers in a military campaign that would fail, and then he would never be heard from again, not blessing the children of Israel, nor blessing the nations as a whole based on precepts that come from the scriptures. No, the Egyptian is a man who we don't know his tribal identity at all, who claimed to be somebody, tried to storm Jerusalem and failed. And that's it. And this is the same one that the Apostle Paul was mistaken for when he had his own conversion experience and himself made a total 180 to the point of death to go to the different nations and speak of Christ, because he generally believed this man was hostile to Christ. The Apostle Paul generally believed Christ commissioned him to do this work, which we can look and see not only from the book of Acts, but his own writings, as well as the testimony before the first century ends of his death at the hands of Rome. The same oppressive government that stopped the Egyptian killed the apostles, and yet their message spread the world over and even into our contemporary time. So the effect and the ministry of the Messiah in broad and specific ways does not match the Egyptian, this Egyptian miracle-working prophet who said Jerusalem will come and fall down like Jericho, and I will be his king. The scriptures does not match what this man did, but it matches Jesus, Yeshua, to a T, from a non-presuppositional examination as well as a motif, and seeing all the literal parallels from a motif perspective. And Jesus, let's remember, is totally consistent with the law in his ministry. Matthew 5, verses 17 to 19. So with that being said, y'all be blessed in the Messiah. This is to show us that it's not just looking at things Jesus fulfilled. When you compare anyone else who claimed to be the Messiah, they always fail where Jesus succeeded. Next, we're going to look at Simon Bar Kokhba and see how, even though it seems like God actually used him or could have used him, even he fails the messianic qualification where Jesus succeeded. Y'all be blessed in the Most High, and I'll see you all in the next video. All right. Peace.